and thank you for joining me today. Today we're going to be exploring ancestry. Ancestry is another important aspect of creating an individual's biological profile. Ancestry in forensic anthropology refers to an individual's genetic heritage rather than their race. To assess a skeleton's ancestry, specific features of the skeleton are observed, as some features are more popular and more variant in one population than another. From observing a skeleton's morphology, you cannot determine that individual's eye colour or that individual's skin colour. However, you may be able to place them into one of three broad geographical categories, and these categories are European, African and Asian. Even though there are these three geographical categories, there are of course still variation within a population itself, so there may be crossovers between populations. Ancestry is estimated by measuring, observing and analysing skeletal remains, in particular the skull. The morphology of the skull is examined in detail and measurements are also taken, and once all this data has been collected, this data is compared to data of worldwide populations. This then allows conclusions to be made of this individual's geographical origin. Determining a person's ancestry is important with successfully and correctly getting this individual identified. Not only that, but determining ancestry can assist with facial reconstruction. So this is working from the skeleton and being able to produce an image essentially of what this person would look like if they were alive. So this again would help with getting this individual correctly identified. So now we're going to look at the three geographical categories: European, African and Asian. Here I have skulls of European ancestry, African ancestry and also Asian ancestry. Generally speaking, skulls of European ancestry are more narrow and long. They have a fairly flat facial profile and have more sharply angled nasal bones. Skulls of African ancestry have wider nasal cavities and a more prominent mouth region. And skulls of an Asian ancestry are more short and wide and have more prominent cheekbones. Of course, these are generalisations of a population, so of course there's some variation to this for individuals themselves. Now, if we look at the specific features of a skull, we can explore ancestry variation in a little bit more detail. So if we look at the front view of the skull, the features which we're going to be focusing on are the nasal bridge, the nasal aperture and also the orbital shape, so the shape of your eye sockets. In skulls of European ancestry, the nasal bridge is more pinched and narrow, the nasal aperture is narrow and the orbital shape is more angular/sloping. In skulls of African ancestry, the nasal bridge is broad and more rounded, the nasal aperture is wide and the orbital shape is more rectangular. In skulls of Asian ancestry, the nasal bridge is wide and tented. The nasal aperture is moderate, so in between European and African, and the orbital shape is more rounded. It's worth noting that it is believed that sexual dimorphisms also play a part in the orbital shape. So generally speaking, females have more rounded orbital shapes, whereas males have more of a rectangular orbital shape. So therefore, this may need to be taken into consideration when assessing the morphological features of a skull, especially for ancestry. Next, we'll move on to the profile view of the skull. So that's looking at the skull from the side, so like this side. And the features we'll be focusing on are the zygomatics and the nasal spine. In skulls of European ancestry, the zygomatics are narrow and retreating, and the nasal spine is well developed. In skulls of African ancestry, the zygomatics are retreating and there is no nasal spine present. In skulls of Asian ancestry, the zygomatics are flaring and wide and the nasal spine is present but not quite as pronounced as in those skulls of European ancestry. So here you can see all three skulls together. So estimating ancestry from skeletal remains can be quite complex. The skull is the main skeletal component which is used to estimate an individual's ancestry. But of course, sometimes we do not have a complete skeleton, or the skull can be missing, or the skull can even be damaged, so we can't assess the skull morphology to see the different characteristics. So there are other aspects of the skeleton which can be used to help estimate an individual's ancestry, such as the femur. However, the skull is the most reliable and accurate way of estimating an individual's ancestry. I hope you've enjoyed learning about ancestry estimation with me today. I hope you've learnt something new. See you soon!